how do you get a six-pack fast? This is exactly what I'm going to be covering in this video. I'm going to give you the step-by-step approach that I've used for myself, as well as many of my clients, in order to get them a six-pack. Now, I'm someone who's very data-driven, and so I actually do track all of this stuff, including one stat that's pretty cool, which is 83% of my own clients have a six-pack. I'll pop up a couple of transformations up here, just so you can kind of see their before and afters, since you know that I'm not just full of crap. Now, importantly, you probably also want to know whether or not I've actually done this before. So I'll also pop up another photo somewhere here of my own transformation. Now, this was a 50-pound difference in weight. Okay, so, the other photo, you can see I'm about 285 pounds. So pretty overweight. And the after photo, I'm 235 pounds. So I lost a little bit over 50 pounds. And that took me about 7 months. Now, that was a couple of years ago. So one of the things that a lot of people sometimes ask is, okay, well, have you been able to maintain those results? So here's a photo that was taken just a couple of weeks ago. I'm actually about 255 in this photo. And so I'm about 20 pounds heavier and I'm leaner than I was before. So the answer is yes, I have been able to maintain the results, and I've been able to do so using the exact approach that I'm going to share with you guys here. Now, I think it's very important to understand that there are many various approaches that are going to work for you. And so we kind of want to talk a little bit about what a successful dieting approach is actually going to look like. So we need to cover three main criteria. The first is the approach needs to yield the fastest possible results because we're trying to get a six-pack fast, okay? Next is we want to have the least amount of downsides because there are always going to be downsides when you are dieting, especially if you're doing it more rapidly. Third, it needs to be sustainable, okay? And that comes back to the point I was making a little while ago, right? With, yes, anyone can achieve a six-pack, but can you sustain it for a long period of time? And that's much more difficult. So we need to make sure we're checking off all three of those boxes. This is really important because, as most people know, roughly 95% of diets fail according to the research. Now, they don't fail because most people can't lose weight. They fail because most people lose weight, but the approach that they adopt is not based on a behavioral-based approach. It's not based on a lifestyle intervention. They do all of these very extreme things they absolutely cannot tolerate for a long period of time, so they end up getting results, and because they can't tolerate, they reach eventually that cutoff point, and then they see significant recidivism. So as I mentioned, 95% of people successfully lose weight, but then they gain all that weight back. And in many cases, they actually gain more than their initial starting point. So we do not want that. We want to make sure we're avoiding it. So the approach that we utilize matters. Now, I want to highlight a little example for you. If you go onto Facebook and you search up a bunch of different, dietary groups, whether it be keto, paleo, carnivore, or really anything else, you're going to notice they all have a couple things in common. They've got tens of thousands of people who all claim that their way is the best. They all say the exact same things. I've tried every other diet out there, did it for years and it didn't work. Finally, I found this particular dietary approach and I got the results I want and I've been able to keep them long term. I feel incredible, blah, 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 okay? Now, they can't all be right about every other diet not working because we can see that there's tens of thousands of people in all of these groups and all of them are purporting to have great results. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is the approach that they utilized was better suited to them. That's the main thing. If you hate carbohydrates, a high-carb diet, being a vegetarian or a vegan, probably not going to be very successful for you. If you hate eating meat or if you hate eating animal products, a carnivore diet's probably not going to be very good for you. And then there's a bunch of practical and kind of more pragmatic considerations that also you need to be aware of, but I think you kind of get the gist. So it's very important to match the approach to the individual as opposed to trying to take an individual and then just sort of put them into a pre-existing framework. We need to understand the fundamentals and the principles of dieting so that we can take them and adapt them to a variety of circumstances, specifically your circumstance, so you can get that six-pack as fast as you possibly can in the most sustainable way with seeing the least amount of downsides. So we need to understand where your starting point is. So for instance, how experienced are you? How knowledgeable are you? If you're not very experienced with dieting, you probably can't adopt a very aggressive. You probably can't tolerate 15 or 20 different things at once, whereas other individuals who are more advanced can take on much more. It's the same thing when you start a job. The moment you start a job, you're kind of swimming in deep water. It's very challenging. But after a couple of years, or maybe even a couple of months, you really get a grasp on it and you can tolerate much more. So your workload increases. The amount that you can tolerate all at once goes up substantially. And so it's the exact same thing when it comes to dieting, because we need to understand that this is not just about eat this, don't eat that. It is a 365 completely comprehensive approach to nutrition. We need to understand how this integrates from your physiology, your social environment, and also your psychology. So all of these things matter. How different is your current lifestyle from the one that you want to eventually adopt, right? So again, if you're taking advice from a professional bodybuilder and you're like, oh, he does this, therefore I should do that. Well, that's great. And he's doing a really good job, but I guarantee you he didn't do that at the beginning. So if you're not where he is, you probably shouldn't be doing what he's doing. That doesn't mean you can't extract any value from it, but it doesn't mean you need to be very cautious about thinking that what he's doing will apply to your circumstance. We need to understand that it's very important to understand the process. You need an educational component. You need a skill acquisition component. And we're going to talk about all this stuff and develop everything as we go along. But you need to understand this because when we look at adjacent data, right, we see that not only do 95% of people who are dieting fail because they eventually experience recidivism, but when we look at all sorts of different aspects of life, right, including lottery winners within 2 to 5 years are broke, right? They had all the money that they could possibly want, but they didn't learn the skills of actually developing enough value or developing products and services to actually push out into the market that people are willing to exchange their money for. They didn't learn anything about financial management or financial literacy. They're just given something. They don't know how to manage it, and so they completely just waste everything. And that's what a lot of people do when it comes to dieting. They adopt an approach, they can sustain it for a short period, and eventually they just kind of fall off. So we want to make sure you're not doing that. Let's talk about different rates of weight loss and who it might be appropriate for. So for instance, if you're a strength athlete, I'll generally recommend a slower rate of weight loss so we can sustain performance. If you have a very rapid weight loss, especially if you're a bigger guy, like let's say 250, 300 pounds, you need to be very cautious about the rate of weight loss because if you lose weight too rapidly, your leverages are going to change. So if you start losing weight around your belly, and when you go into the squat, you're used to having your stomach to push into your thighs to rebound out of the hole, guess what? If your leverages change, that means your execution can change. That means your performance can go down temporarily. Even though you're not necessarily weaker, the leverages are going to change the actual performance or your strength expression because force production is not the only thing when it comes to strength expression. So 0.5% of your body weight loss per week is generally very good for athletes. People who are competitive athletes where performance is a really, really important factor in their training. It's also a very good rate of weight loss for people who are maybe a little bit newer because it's very sustainable. A 1% rate of body weight loss per week is a little bit more challenging and it's a little bit less sustainable. Okay, that doesn't make it bad. In fact, the rate of weight loss that you experience can change. So for instance, if I'm starting with someone who's a little bit, has a little bit more fat to lose, we might adopt a slightly more aggressive approach at the beginning and then kind of taper it off. And that's not necessarily an intentional thing. That's just kind of something that normally happens when you begin that approach, right? People tend to lose a little bit more weight rapidly, and that kind of makes them a little bit more, pumped up about it, but they're also not very adherent in the beginning. So they're just kind of going high, low, like if their calories are super high one day, they kind of course correct. And so there's all sorts of things in the beginning where they're just sort of figuring it out. And so we might experience more rapid weight loss in the beginning, but then once they begin to dial in their adherence and everything like that, it starts to kind of taper off and it slows down into a little bit more of a sustainable approach. You can have different rates of weight loss depending on different phases of your diet. Now, if you're losing at a rate of more than 1% per week, that ends up being much less sustainable. Now, I will again create a caveat. If you're someone who's very, very big, so for instance, I have a client of mine who's 360, and so we can lose weight at much faster than 1% body weight loss per week initially. And that's not a problem at all. And the reason why it's not a problem is because we're not just losing fat. We're losing water, we're losing food content in the gut because we're changing their diet, which means their weight's going to reduce, generally getting off of a lot of the highly ultra-processed foods. So because of that, there's less inflammation, there's less water retention, less sodium, all sorts of different things that are going to cause your weight to drop drastically. So again, that kind of comes back to what I was discussing earlier about having a really rapid initial weight loss and then it kind of tapers off. But that's not fat loss necessarily, and those two things are very distinctly different. Now, who is better suited for slow versus fast weight loss? Okay, well, for obese individuals, fast can be fine so long as it's sustainable. Because again, for those individuals, the most important thing is just losing weight from like a health perspective, even if we're not talking aesthetics. So they have a lot more fat to lose, which means they can lose more pounds of fat per week, and it's going to represent a smaller percentage of the total body weight lost either way. So they can adopt a faster approach. However, in most cases, again, because we want to really reinforce the lifestyle change, that usually isn't sustainable for them. So you can have rapid weight loss initially, but then it generally should taper off, and the goal should not be to lose very fast. It should be to lose sustainably with, again, the least amount of downsides and to actually maintain it and things like that. So obese individuals, fast is okay, but generally not so good long term. People with body weight or body image issues, slow if it's even appropriate at all. So if you're someone who has like major body dysmorphia, if you have like an actual diagnosed eating disorder or anything like that, you probably don't want to be dieting in the first place. If you are going to diet, definitely do it under like supervision of like a clinician, like a psychologist or something like that can actually be of service, because that can be very dangerous, okay? If you're a performance athlete, so as I mentioned earlier, performance athletes generally should be losing weight a little bit slower. Now, again, it does depend. So if you're doing a water cut, that's drastic. You're doing a water cut though. You're not cutting your actual body weight. You're just cutting water, okay? So again, it is different, but it still will affect performance. So we're not just talking about weight manipulation. We're talking about the loss of actual tissue, whether it be, fat mass or muscle or anything like that. Physique athletes can lose slow, they can lose moderate, they can lose fast. It really just depends on the context. For instance, if I have an athlete who's like really, really jacked, I know some athletes that I coach where I'll put them through like a 16 to 24 week diet. That's a very long dieting phase, but it's very gradual. And they get great results from it. Their performance continues to improve. They retain all of their muscle and they get really freaking lean. So it takes a little bit longer, but they don't have any of the other downsides. Where if you're only concerned about purely your aesthetics, then yeah, you can diet down really quickly. You could, in like a 6 to 8 week period, have a really aggressive diet and shed off like 20 pounds or something like that in a very short period of time. That's a very aggressive cut, but it's totally doable. So again, the experience level matters. So physique-based athletes can do moderate. They're probably gonna be best off with more of a moderate approach. But again, depending on the context, depending on the goals and whatever's going on, we can do slow, fast, or moderate, and it's totally fine if it's appropriate. For general health, I would generally say moderate. Like a slow to moderate approach is probably going to be best for the vast majority of people. And if you're not sure where you fall because you have all these different goals or competing goals, I'd probably say just err on the side of slow to moderate. It's probably going to be best for most people. Now, more experience can do a variety of different rates, like I was talking about for physique-based athletes. Less experience, again, you're better off slow to moderate. And that's just something that I've noticed in my own coaching approach. And I've been coaching for, well over 12 years now. So I've coached thousands of individuals, and that's just kind of been my uniform experience. So here's some conditions to consider. When we're creating a calorie deficit, all of the other variables, that's going to determine what kind of weight we're losing. Are we losing muscle? Are we losing just a bunch of water? Are we losing fat mass? Okay, so a couple things to consider. One, does the deficit tank your energy and your training? If your training performance goes way down, that's no bueno. We don't want that. Again, from a sustainability standpoint, we need to train hard to preserve muscle mass. We need to train hard to make sure that we're not only burning enough calories and things like that, even though exercise isn't necessarily going to be the primary source of the calorie deficit, but it's still very important. So we need to make sure we're still preserving muscle mass, we're still preserving strength and performance, we're still getting effective training in, and you're not just completely beat up. We want to make sure that we don't increase our risk of injury unnecessarily because we're trying to push tons of volume and our training is super way down. So there's a lot of things to consider, but again, if your training begins to nosedive, probably not the best. We probably need to back off a little bit, especially if you are losing weight at a very rapid pace, then that might be an indication we need to pull back a bit. Okay. Does the deficit cause disruption to your sleep? Does it cause you substantial stress? These are things that absolutely happen. I have seen many, many clients who, when they're really deep in a dieting phase, their sleep is disrupted. They're really stressed. They're really irritable. They're super moody. You look at contest prep bodybuilders, IFBB Pro, Olympia level, things like that. They get super irritable. Like when you start getting that lean, that can cause stress in your relationships. It can cause, impaired performance at work and a whole host of other things. So we need to make sure that we're minimizing these things. And if you start experiencing a lot of these side effects, we probably just need to back things off a little bit. Now, that's assuming you're doing all the other stuff right, but mostly it's because of an energy deficit. The energy deficit might just be too large, okay? Now, does the deficit elicit substantial cravings and psychological stress or an obsessive focus around food? If you become extremely food focused and obsessive about it, during your diet, you're probably being a little bit too aggressive. Or if you're not being aggressive, maybe you're just not necessarily in the best spot to really diet. Maybe you need to do some additional work before you get into your diet. But again, this is a very, very important thing to understand. If you're experiencing a lot of food focus and your cravings are through the roof, there's probably a couple of things that you're doing wrong. And so you need to understand that these are all indications that something is going wrong. Your sleep should not be super fucked up. You should not be crazy stressed out. Now, again, the context, if you're a pro bodybuilder, you just kind of have to suck it up and do your best. But you still don't want to experience that even if you are competitive, because sleep and all that stuff is also going to affect your performance and even your physique and how it looks, water retention, all sorts of stuff. So these are still going to apply, but just to different levels and different contexts. Does the deficit impair your work performance? Does the deficit impair your relationships? If you're super grumpy all the time and you and your wife or you and your husband are just kind of getting at it all the time, whereas before you were totally fine, the deficit might be causing that. That's a very common thing. When people, like I've heard stories and I've actually in some cases even known people who have actually separated during a bodybuilding competition because it ends up being a lot for the individual who's dieting. Generally, you're feeling just really stretched thin. You're feeling exhausted all the time. You're emotionally spent. It can be very difficult if you're really deep into a diet. So again, these are all things that are sort of like act as canary in the coal mine to signify that maybe you're pushing a little bit too hard or maybe you're not necessarily doing things in the most effective way. Now, we can't talk about diet without talking about exercise. So exercise is extremely important. Is this the primary factor for driving your weight loss? No. However, it's an incredibly important variable because all successful weight loss approaches have an exercise component. So it's not just about driving a calorie deficit. We need to understand the behaviors that are driving the calorie deficit, okay? Because it's easy to cut calories, but we have to also think about the longevity of it. So if we need to ensure that we're preserving muscle mass, we need to ensure that we're sustaining the behaviors that result in long-term success, we need to have an exercise element. It's critical. I don't think it's optional. People always pit diet and exercise against each other, and they say which is most important. And a lot of the times you might hear things like, oh, getting lean is 80% diet. It's just not true. It's just not even remotely close to true. It's like saying which is more important, the wheels in your car or the ignition. If you take either of them out, your car's not going anywhere. You need both. And it's kind of silly in my mind to try and pit them against each other. Especially if you're serious about getting a six-pack in a shorter period of time, you just have to adopt an exercise program. And if you're not willing to adopt an exercise program, then honestly, you may as well just shut this off. And the rest of what I'm saying is just not really going to help you because clearly you don't actually even want this. So a couple things we can really focus on. First is adopting a higher step count and tapping into something called energy flux. So energy balance is basically where your energy intake, your calorie intake, matches the amount of calories you burn throughout the day. So let's say I'm consuming 2,000 calories and I'm burning roughly 2,000 calories throughout the day. I'm going to remain weight stable. But let's say I decide to consume 3,000 calories, but congruently, I also increase my step count or my energy expenditure side of things. Well, now I'm eating 3,000 calories, but I'm also burning 3,000 calories. So I'm at energy balance at 3,000. I'm also at energy balance at 2,000. But I've adjusted my exercise activity or the amount of just general activity or expenditure in order to match my intake. So adopting what's called a high flux approach means that we're increasing general activity and it's intentional for the purpose of burning more calories. And there's other reasons to it, but like adopting a higher step count can actually be really beneficial for helping regulate your appetite, for stabilizing blood sugar. If I have clients who have diabetes or they're pre-diabetic or something like that, I might often actually get them to go on a 10-minute walk. That's one of the most effective things you can do to stabilize your blood sugar right away. So it's very, very effective. Even though it's just a walk, people think it's not effective. Super, super important for health and longevity, okay? So we're checking off a bunch of different boxes at the same time, which ends up being really great. Next thing, we need to engage in regular, hard resistance training, 3 to 4 times per week, okay? Now, that's very important because we need to preserve muscle mass. If you're in a calorie deficit, that means our bodies are going to look to pull energy from the available sources. What are the available sources? Fat, glycogen, muscle. Those are the 3 sources that we're generally going to pull from, all right? If we're not lifting weights, we're not doing enough to preserve our muscle mass. So we're going to lose muscle. That's very important. We don't want to lose muscle. If you lose muscle while you're getting lean, you're going to look like a flabby skeleton. You're not going to have a nice physique when you end your diet. So we need to make sure that you are staying lean by resistance training. You're preserving your muscle mass. Very, very important. Has a lot of other additional benefits beyond just preserving muscle. But again, I talk about a lot of that stuff in more depth in other lectures, so you can check that stuff out there. Now, you can do abdominal work to make your abs hypertrophy and make them a little bit more visible when you get lean. But the vast majority of the time, it's just about losing fat. That's really what it is. If you don't have abs, you don't have visible abs, most of the time it's not because you're not doing enough sit-ups. Most of the time it's just because you have too much body fat and your abs are just underneath that. That's usually what it is, okay? Now, additional cardio is not necessary in the beginning. In fact, I generally recommend against doing a bunch of cardio to burn fat. Now, there's a difference between doing conditioning to help enhance your performance, help enhance your recovery, versus doing cardio specifically for burning more calories. Okay, these are very different. I am a big proponent of doing conditioning. Even if I have like a strength athlete, my strength athletes will still be doing conditioning on a regular basis because their work capacity needs to be sufficient enough to actually tolerate the type of training and recovery and things like that. If you're a physique-based athlete, you still should be doing some form of conditioning on a regular basis. And again, that's going to, undulate depending on where you're at in your, competitive season or whatever it might be. But conditioning is still very important for your actual performance. But in terms of just straight up cardio, I will tell my clients to leave that out. and then we might put that in down the road, but I generally won't put that into my clients' dietary approaches, right? Or their intervention design. Because again, it's just a tool that we can wait to pull that lever. And if we do start to plateau and we've already implemented that, we can't really go anywhere. Whereas if we haven't implemented that, we can pull that lever and kickstart further results. And then again, there's a bunch more other levers that we can pull as well, which is why we want to make sure we have a graded approach and we don't just do everything at once and throw everything at the wall. Now, let's look at your dietary composition. Your diet and the food that you're actually consuming is very, very important. It's not just about a calorie deficit, because how you achieve the calorie deficit is also very important. We can look at something called the food palatability reward hypothesis, which is essentially where the consumption of ultra-processed calorically dense food increase your propensity to eat more of this ultra-processed calorically dense food. So part of this is because the density's not really there, or the volume's not really there. So for instance, 2,000 calories of, chips, you can eat like that. 2,000 calories of chicken breast, you're probably not even gonna be able to eat that in one sitting, maybe not even throughout the entire day, right? So in terms of what's easier to eat and consume before your satiety signals really kick in, it's way easier to eat ultra-processed food. And because it's hyperpalatable, it's going to make you actually crave that food more. So there's a lot of downsides from eating ultra-processed foods that aren't even necessarily just health-related, right? So from a health-related standpoint, though, generally pretty devoid of micronutrients, phytochemicals, things like that. Not really great for you. Usually there's lots of processing in there that actually has very detrimental health effects, especially long-term, the gain of body fat and things like that, which is a massive, massive issue for health conditions. Obesity is a precursor to pretty much every disease out there. And so you don't want to be eating a bunch of ultra-processed foods. You want to be eating mostly whole foods, higher food volume, lower caloric density, higher micronutrient and phytochemical profiles, lots of good fiber, lots of really healthy food. You're going to feel more satiated, so it's higher on the satiety index. All sorts of things like that are going to make it very beneficial for you to eat mostly whole foods. Then we can move on to sleep and stress management. Now, sleep impacts your recovery. It's going to impact your hunger signaling. Sleep is going to impact the type of tissue or the type of energy substrate that you're using. So you remember, we can lose body weight by utilizing glycogen, by utilizing muscle, by utilizing fat. Okay, so your sleep is going to largely dictate which energy substrate we're going to use. In fact, I've lectured on this before in another lecture, which you can check out, where sleep restriction in a calorie deficit resulted in a 55% less fat lost and 60% more lean mass lost. Sleep impairment also affects your cognition. It affects your ability to make good decisions. It affects your problem-solving ability. It affects your psychomotor vigilance. It affects your desire to take on cognitively demanding tasks. So like dieting, like going to the gym when you're tired, you're more likely to say no to difficult tasks. So we want to make sure that your sleep and your stress are in check. Now, if you want to learn more about recovery and stress, because I have multiple resources, I want to give them to you. So I wrote a very in-depth research review on stress as well as recovery. For Kabuki Strength and for Elite FTS. Now, Kabuki Strength is no longer a thing, so I've turned both of these into ebooks or little reports. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, head over, and then make sure you send me a DM. Just let me know that you're watching this video and ask for the two resources, and I'll send them your way, okay? I'll send them to you personally. So you can check that out, and we'll go from there. Now, one thing that's important to remember as well is I'm going to be giving you specifics for calories, the deficits, and all that stuff, but the week prior to this being released, I also made a video on what a day of eating should look like. So if you want to really, really get into the nitty-gritty of the actual diet composition, the specific foods you should be eating, and all sorts of nitty-gritty details, make sure you go and check that video out, because it'll also help give you tons more information and really specific steps to take that's going to help you apply this stuff so you can get a six-pack really, really fast. But now we're talking about calories and macros. Here's the thing. You can find a free macronutrient or calorie tracker on the internet. It's really not that hard. Now, is it an accurate one? Is it this? It really doesn't matter. All you need to do is get into the ballpark. If you follow that calorie intake for a little while, for a week, you're going to tell if your body weight's trending up or if your body weight's trending down or if you're just staying stable. And then you just make an adjustment. So it's literally that simple. You don't need the most accurate thing. You just need something to get you into the ballpark, and then you can adjust after that, okay? Once your body weight is stable, you can adopt a slow or moderate or fast approach. Anywhere between a 5 to 10% deficit is a fairly slow approach. 10 to 15% deficit, maybe even 10 to 20% deficit sometimes, more of a moderate approach. And then 15 to 25% deficit is more of a fast approach. Now, macros, you can have kind of a range. So for protein intake, generally, the research shows that you should have anywhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, if you're a lot leaner, probably have more. If you're a lot fatter, probably have a little on the less side, okay? If you are a lot fatter and you still love having protein, then sure, by all means, go hard. It's not going to have any sort of negative effect, so you don't need to worry about that. I'm just talking about meeting your requirements from like a recovery, muscular preservation standpoint, general health, things like that. If you have a lot of excess body fat, you can definitely err on the side of the lower end of that side of things, so the 1.6, 1.7 or whatever. And if you're very, very lean, then yeah, maybe the 2.2 and even more. Like you can eat even more and that's totally fine. I generally would not go less. I eat a lot of protein. I actually eat quite a bit more than 2.2 grams per kilogram, by like quite a bit. But that's because I love protein. I love eating animal like meat. I just feel really good on it. I perform really well and my energy's better. And so that's why I like it. Now, fat intake is going to be around 15 to 25% of total calories. Okay, fat is essential. So we do need fat for absorption of all sorts of different vitamins. We need it for hormones. We need it for all sorts of different things. So we do need to have a minimum requirement. And research shows that it's generally about 15 to 25% of your total caloric intake. Okay, now remaining calories can come from carbohydrates. So let's say you have 1,000 calories and 40% of that is protein and 30% or like, I don't know, 20% is coming from fat. And the other 40% can be coming from carbohydrates, okay? And that's kind of how you can do it. Now, there is variability in terms of what people can tolerate here. So I know some clients who just really, really, really feel a whole lot better on a really high-fat diet. Like I'm talking women that only weigh like 140 pounds, eating like 100 grams of fat sometimes, like 70 to 100 grams of fat. That's a lot of fat, but they just feel way better. Their adherence is way better. Their sleep is better. So sure, why not? No problem whatsoever. Other people, it's the exact opposite. They don't like eating lots of fats, but they crush carbohydrates and they feel amazing and their performance is great. That's fine too, okay? So there are general rules and guidelines, but there's still some flexibility in there for individual variability. Now, dieting periods. So dieting periods are really important because if you're new to dieting, probably only an 8 to 12 week diet is going to be sufficient for you, okay? And the reason why I say 8 to 12 weeks is because in that period, you're going to be developing a lot of skills, okay? So in my experience, my client, like in the first 6 weeks, only lost like a couple of pounds. Like it wasn't anything really crazy. But then in the next 8 weeks, they lost like a huge amount of weight. Well, why is that? Wouldn't weight loss slow down as you go further? Wouldn't you plateau earlier? And it totally makes sense to think that because you would suspect that your rate of weight loss is going to slow as you go forward. But the difference here is that her adherence started becoming much more dialed in. So the first 6 weeks, she wasn't really adhering. She was kind of building up the skills, getting used to it, learning how to organize her life, learning how to do meal prep, learning how to kind of time chunk her day. And so she had enough time to do everything that she wanted to do. And then once she kind of got that, boom, her results just blew up, took off. And again, now she has a six pack. And if you want to see that, you can actually check on the last video and you can, I show a bunch of results of clients on that one too. So for a lot of people, the first diet that you're going to do, you're going to see great results. But a large part of it is really just going to be learning how to diet effectively. It's going to be building up a lot of skills. It's going to be learning a lot. And then your next diet oftentimes is going to be more effective and produce even better results because now you've got everything in place. You know what to expect, you know what you experienced, and you know what you did wrong and what you would do differently next time. And so you're going to be in a much better position. So the first diet, usually very successful. Second diet, usually more successful. If you're more experienced, you can diet for longer. As I mentioned earlier, like I've had clients diet for 16 to 24 weeks, totally fine, and they see better results in that case. But again, that's context dependent. If you're more experienced, you can also diet faster. 6 to 8 weeks doing a really aggressive cut, totally fine if you can tolerate it. But again, that's more for experienced people. I would never put someone who's inexperienced in a very aggressive cut like that. Even if they were like, well, I'm just going to the beach and I don't really care about my results after, I'm just not going to do that. That's my personal opinion. It's irresponsible. It's not good for them psychologically. It's not good for them health-wise. So I'm not willing to do that. Even if I'm not willing to do that for money because at the end of the day, their health, their results, their performance, their mental well-being comes first over me getting a paycheck. Now, if they've demonstrated an aptitude and they want to try it and they've shown me that they can probably handle it, then sure, why not? No problem there whatsoever. I'm definitely not opposed to challenging people, but again, you don't want to put anyone in a potentially precarious position where they can do harm to themselves. Now, after the diet, it's very important that you go into a maintenance phase where the goal of the maintenance phase is to just remain weight stable. Now, weight stability could be anywhere between, if you sustain that weight loss, you're somewhere within 2 to 3 pounds or something like that of your final weight, that's totally fine. And the reason for that is primarily to decay psychological fatigue. Once you start getting super, super lean, we have metabolic adaptations that occur and a whole host of other things. But assuming that this is just the first diet that you're doing and you're going to go into another diet after because you're not quite lean enough yet, you want to make sure that you have a maintenance phase to decay a lot of the psychological fatigue. Because dieting is challenging. It can be a stress. It can be a burden, as we mentioned, on your work, on your relationships, on all sorts of different things. So we want to make sure that as you're going through this stuff, you're not just building up fatigue, because as fatigue accumulates, as psychological stress and all that stuff accumulates, your adherence is going to start to backslide. So we don't want to just, white knuckle it all the way through. We want to make sure that we can kind of cut things off, which is why I say 8 to 12 weeks. And then after that, go into a maintenance phase. You might not feel like you need it. You might not feel like you want it. Go into it anyways, because it's going to save you. And then once you've gone through that, you want to basically get to the point where you're really eager to get back onto a diet. If you go through that maintenance phase and you're in there for 8 weeks and you're like, oh my God, I cannot wait to get back to dieting, that's a really good indication that you are ready to go back into a diet, okay? Now that might not always be there, but generally it is, and generally it means you're set up psychologically. And if you've done everything well and you've sustained a lot of the general habits you built up during your deficit, then you're in a really good position to go into the next deficit and lose the remaining amount of weight. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, if you've done a good job, you should lose a ton of fat. And then basically you just go into the maintenance and then you go into another deficit and you just repeat that process over and over and over until you actually reach your goals. So at this point, you're all set up. You have everything you need to in order to have a very, very productive diet and get lean super fast and get a six-pack. I would also highly recommend you actually check out my video from the previous week where I do discuss what a day of eating should look like, because this is also going to give you much more specifics in terms of how to get a six-pack really fast. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.